Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Excuse me. Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Now, some people are still celebrating the 25th anniversary, and that's fine. They'll join us. Yeah, they'll join us in a minute. But we're going to move right into our final presentation of the day, and that's on how to facilitate self-determination in mediation with Dan Simon. Now, Dan is a mediator and mediation trainer, and he specializes in the transformative approach. He's also an author, and his most recent book with co-author Tara West is Self-Determination in Mediation, The Art and Science of Mirrors and Lights. Let's welcome Dan Simon.
Thanks. And we got this. Oh, yeah, it's working. Nice. Yes, my most recent book, you said. Also my only book, my first book. So I'm pretty excited about it. My favorite book that I've written. Thank you so much for sticking it out this late, everybody. I would like this to be a conversation. We've got a good-sized crowd, so keep your comments concise, but I'd like you to feel free to make them in this conversation. The experience of learning stuff, much like the experience of having a change in one's perspective about a conflict one is in, involves the participation of the victims, of the clients or the students. The only meaningful thing that can happen that can make things different, both when you're learning something and when you are trying to get to a better place with a conflict, has to happen within the human who is trying to be helped. And that might seem obvious or profound, I'm not sure. But that is what I'd like to talk about for the next hour. The idea that if something important is going to happen in mediation, most of it doesn't happen up here with the mediator. It mostly happens, and I'm using you all as a analogy for mediation participants, but that's all by way of saying, please participate in this conversation much as I would like you to participate if you were my mediation clients. So to start us thinking about this idea of self-determination in mediation, I'd like to ask you all why self-determination matters in mediation. You hear a lot about it, and we learned, that it's been elevated into the body of Rule 114. Yeah, here's an answer.
People are more likely to commit to what they create.
People are more likely to commit to what they create. So, in other words, say they come to an agreement. If they created the agreement, it's more likely that they will follow through on that agreement. Because they own it. So it makes the results of the mediation more long-lasting if the people are genuinely invested in it. Other things to say about why self-determination matters in mediation.
So to have a say in their destiny, their fate, like what they want, I'm moving forward.
So they have a say in what they want. It sounds like you're saying that that's just a value in itself. People getting to make their own choices about their lives itself means something. Yeah. Other things you want to say? Yeah.
Well, I think the litigation process is very non-self-determined. A lot of control with the attorneys, the courts, all the rules for people. And so mediation gives them an opportunity to say, this is what I want. This is what I will do. So it gives them a little sense of ownership of the issue, the legal issue.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that particularly in contrast to the litigation process where there are people like judges and lawyers controlling a lot of things. It allows mediation to be very different from that and more focused on the parties themselves. Great, I love it that there are a lot of different takes on this. I'm reminded of what Ken Cloak talked about earlier today about the many dimensions to conflict, the many dimensions to any deep, meaningful topic. It's not, there's never a simple Well, there is one simple answer, and then there's another simple answer on another level, and then there's a complicated answer on another level. Anyway, keep them coming. I saw this hand.
I think that both sides come out feeling like they won in a mediation. If they're both having input, there isn't a loser in it. They both feel like they came out with a good outcome.
Both sides in a mediation where they had self-determination can feel like they won. Not something that can happen in a situation where the decisions are made by somebody else. Yeah, nice.
I think when I think of conflict, I think of people being in crisis and not feeling as though they have control over the situation. And when we allow for create self-determination opportunities, it's really empowering for them. And I think it goes beyond that conflict. It's something that they can take into the relationship later or other relationships once they have that experience of being able to be, I want to say in control, maybe that's too strong of a word, but empowered in the face of something that's been overwhelming to them.
So this being in conflict is a crisis in which one of the parts of the experience is being out of control. And so the experience of being in control, getting control in that situation is good for that situation, but also can go beyond that. It can be kind of a lasting sort of empowerment experience. So these are gorgeous. And I appreciate, the sentiment that all of those contain, which is that self-determination is a big deal. I have my own way of articulating why self-determination is a big deal. And it's kind of a winding path that I'm going to take you to my take on it. I'll buy into all these, by the way, as well. But as a way to think about an additional aspect of why self-determination is such a big deal, I'd like you to do a little exercise with me, which involves the following. If you could think back to the worst conflict that you yourself have been directly involved in. That's right, not where you were a mediator or a lawyer, maybe if that really got out of control and was intense for you personally, but more likely you and a spouse, an ex-spouse, a sibling, a business partner. Think back to the worst one that you yourself have been directly involved in, and I'm going to be quiet for a second so you can do this. Does everybody have one to focus on? You got to have one, or this whole next few minutes will be lame. Okay. Now, if you could think back to the worst moment of that worst conflict. My question for you is this. What was so bad about that worst moment? I know it was bad because you picked it as the worst. Can anybody give me a phrase or a word that captures what was so bad about it? What did you hate about that moment?
Safety.
Safety. I gather your safety was in question. Mm-hmm. You felt afraid physically.
Physically, emotionally, everything.
Emotional safety. All around lack of safety on many levels. Yeah.
Stuck.
Stuck. Can you say more about that, stuck?
We couldn't figure it out.
Couldn't figure it out. Didn't know how you're going to figure it out. Had been trying to figure it out. It wasn't working. At a loss for what to do, stuck. Nice.
Waiting.
Waiting. The waiting was hard. Can you say more about why waiting was hard?
I didn't know what the other person was thinking. I was imagining all of the negative things that the other person could be thinking and responding to what I was doing.
Okay, so uncertainty, wondering about things, probably assuming negative given the situation, not knowing, so uncertainty is part of it, and not knowing how to make the certainty come, you had to wait for it somehow. Yeah. Other things you want to say about what was so bad about that worst moment?
It's probably the worst behavior I've seen in other people.
Worst behavior you had seen in other people. this person, so that itself was upsetting. Seeing this other person behave in a way that was just not cool, unacceptable, not how people should behave, that was part of it. Not quite getting why, how could they be behaving that way? That sort of thing. Am I capturing the, yeah.
We were both out of control and behaved in ways we never otherwise would have.
So both of us were out of control, you're saying, but you also behaved in ways that you didn't feel good about.
No.
Yeah. Another one? What she said, and was there
A panic attack.
you had a panic attack?
No, the other person.
The other person did.
Not knowing how to, I don't even know, control or.
Yeah. Not knowing how to help this person who was losing it. Fully legit panic attack. Great. You guys are capturing a very unpleasant moment. The things that you said, I think, hopefully, usually match up well with the stuff that I have listed here already. There are a cluster of aspects of the experience of being in conflict that people tend to report as sucking. That's not the language in the reporting exactly. But they don't care for it. They're not into it. It's bad. And there are two ways to categorize these clusters, this cluster of feelings. Incidentally, I kind of claimed that we were working toward my idea of why self-determination is such a big deal. It's true, but it's not really my idea. It is very much consistent with the so-called transformative theory of conflict, which I'm happy to give you resources on how to learn more about it if you're interested. But it is the theory that I've been subscribing to as I've practiced mediation for a while now. And it rings very true to me. So we're getting to that answer, and I just want to remove the claim that it's my answer, but it's certainly one of mine. These experiences can be categorized into two basic areas. The left-hand column you see there are a variety of ways in which we feel a diminished sense of control, capacity, competence, mastery, clarity, calm, all the things that describe how it feels to be in a good place in terms of your sense of handling life. Ain't happening in that worst moment. So some things you aren't feeling are confident, clear, in control. You're feeling the opposite. Powerless, out of control, stuck, hopeless, overwhelmed, confused, not yourself, behaving in ways that aren't even the ways you like to behave. So weird that you're not being yourself at these moments, but true. The other aspect of it that's also distressing and that some of you mentioned was that there's another person behaving in a way that you don't get. You have some vague ideas, like sometimes I ask people the question of how would you have described that other person at that worst moment? And at that worst moment, you would have perhaps used some diagnoses of them, some quite critical words about what kind of people they were. You would have noticed that they were selfish or crazy, or I run into idiots all the time myself when I'm in this situation. You'd have a judgmental, harsh word for them, but it wouldn't be a word that shows that you are empathizing, connecting, relating, understanding, accepting. Part of the experience, and it's hard to cop to this in the moment, for sure, even afterwards sometimes, that we are self-absorbed. We are focused on the fact that we ourselves are being threatened and in a situation where we feel out of control. It's understandable. We don't have the spare capacity to pay attention to, accept, understand, have compassion for, have, heck, generosity for the other human being, which is stuff we normally like to do, actually. We aren't doing it in that worst moment, and we don't like it. So someone used the word crisis here, and that was very consistent with how the transformative theory looks at the experience of being in conflict. And this combination of feeling both weak and also being self-absorbed can tend to keep us in a vicious circle, sometimes just with ourselves. My favorite example is when I'm on the phone with the cable company. And I've been on the phone for 45 minutes, and they say my call is important to them. And I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to wait longer now? Or am I going to hang up? No, then I'll go to the back of the line. I'm stuck. Holy crap, my life sucks. What am I going to do next? Thoughts of violence enter me at those times. And all they did was put me on hold. So it's not even necessarily, they're just being themselves. They aren't really in a crisis exactly. Probably in the situation that you thought of, it was probably one where you were interacting with somebody. Add to it that usually you're actually interacting with somebody and you're not just on hold. You're naturally behaving in a way that reveals that you aren't particularly compassionate toward this other person at this moment. In fact, you're kind of having the attitude, what the hell are you thinking? Or what are you doing? Or what's wrong with you? Understandably is your tone a little bit towards these people, and they're a bit frustrated by that. They get in this vicious circle themselves, and sometimes this is what's happening when people are in litigation. They, out of desperation, resort to that whole scene, or violence, or war. But this is a way of describing just this phenomenon that happens with humans in conflict. So let me ask you this before I go to that good news slide. Thinking to that conflict that you thought of, back to that conflict you thought of as the worst one you've been involved in, let me ask you this. What, if anything, helped?
Seeing from the other person's perspective, like slowing down enough to see something from their perspective. Slowing down to see from the other person's perspective. Slowing down enough to see from the other person's perspective. Can you say more about how that happened? You realized that's what you needed to do, or was there help from somewhere? I think when someone else honestly shares how the conflict is impacting them, then developing just that little sliver of empathy that allows you to say, well, actually, I would like to understand. Okay. Your perspective. Okay, so it happened within the conversation with them that you were able to realize that their perspective was meaningful and you wanted to hear about it. Mm-hmm. Nice. What are the other stories of what helped anybody in your conflict? If anything, yeah.
Going to therapy, a counselor.
Going to therapy. Talking to the therapist about this situation in particular?
Getting some perspective and understanding my feelings and that type of thing.
Okay, so a third party, in this case a therapist, you talked to a person who wasn't directly involved in the conflict, who was there to help you, and that helped you get to a better place with it. Nice. Yeah.
Need some time and space and removal from the situation so that cooler minds can prevail.
Time and space from the situation. And can you say after that time and space happened, what was different for you?
I think I was physically feeling calmer and more open to hearing things, and I wasn't coming at it with just emotion and anger, but had time to sort of come back to my own self first. Okay. So time and space helped you get calmer and helped you come back to yourself. And the other side, too.
And it happened, the other side also was able to do that with some time and space. Great. Beautiful. Well, so the good news here is that from a variety of different methods, including therapists, including within the conversation itself with the other party, including the opposite of that, having some time and space away from the other party. The good news is, and this reminds me a little bit of what Ken Cloak was talking about when he talked about the magic, this mysterious stuff that we couldn't have predicted. Well, it makes sense that in any particular conflict that we're helping with, we aren't sure if talking to the third party is going to help. We aren't sure if having the conversation is going to help. We aren't sure if some time and space away is going to help. we probably wouldn't have known in advance that that was what would have helped these 3 cases. It is a bit of a mystery. But the one common thing is that somehow humans got to a better place. This vicious circle of conflict does reverse itself. One person, let's say from talking to their therapist, puts this thing into perspective a little bit, realizes, thank goodness she has other resources that don't depend on this conflict, makes her realize that she can actually tolerate, maybe, I'll go off on my tangent now about what might have happened, maybe she realizes, okay, you know what, I can actually listen to that person with their complaints again, and I can be more calm this time. And she does that, and maybe, I don't know, maybe, and then, not like that in your case. And the other person is impacted by that, and we get on this virtuous circle where that experience of weakness diminishes and is replaced with greater sense of strength. I'm not as overwhelmed. I'm calmer. You know, for me on the phone with Comcast, I'm just taking some deep breaths, realizing that I can cancel these people. I don't need cable. By the way, this happened years ago. I haven't had cable for a long time. And I can relax. Okay, I don't need to go do violence to Comcast. That won't really get me any place I want to get to. It's not that confusing. I guess, you know, if I can't complete the call today, I guess I will have to set aside more time when I can get something else productive done while I'm on hold, call them back in a few days, make some decisions that help me aware that I have some control over the situation. The fear, I guess, the fear didn't really quite capture how I was feeling about Comcast, but it's true that somehow we shift to this place of being less afraid, more in control, more aware of what we have control over, that sort of thing. Giving you some lingo from the transformative theory here, that fact that people do shift from weakness to strength, we call the empowerment shift. What generally happens with that naturally for us humans is that once we're feeling calmer, clearer, and more confident, we remember that, oh yeah, by the way, I'm a nice guy too. I don't go actually doing violence most of the time, and I don't need to with Comcast. And heck, I don't even have to hate them right now. And so what comes with that empowerment shift often is what we call the recognition shift, where I'm able to be less self-absorbed and a little bit more willing to accept the humanity of the other person. Notice that this might be very incremental, and it might not include me repairing my relationship with the other person. It might include me deciding, okay, now that I'm in a better place, I get it. This is somebody that I just need to be away from. That's what's going to happen here, but it's based on a clearer sense of myself and the other person. It feels like basically a better choice all around for me. This shift may not, a lot of things it may or may not include. It might not include me deciding to settle a lawsuit with this other person. I might calmly, clearly decide, you know what? I've done what I can here in mediation. I've said what I want to say to this person. I've created the space for them to respond. I'm hearing that they still don't get how much they owe me. And so I'm going to proceed to the next step of litigation. The specific outcomes are unpredictable, but the fact that I, as a human, have the potential and the tendency to make recognition shifts and understand another human better, at least better than I did at that worst moment of the conflict, that exists. Much of this, as I alluded to earlier, happens within each person involved. Again, with Comcast and me, it was all me. They just put me on hold. Perhaps with you and the person you had the worst conflict of your life with, there was this nice reinforcing circle where you looked at them and said, you know what, my bad, I overreacted there a little bit. I was out of line. Tell me what your take is again. You got to a better place where your communication skills came back online and you were able to hear them out, and that has a good impact on them, and good things happen. So that's this next slide that I have no way of predicting what my next slide is. It's magic, actually. But so this happens both internally and between the parties involved. Let's not go there just yet. So that's a long way of giving you my answer to the question of why self-determination is such a big deal. And let me put that into some other words. The crux of that experience, of that crisis of conflict, is that sense of powerless, stuckness, out of controlness, fear, overwhelm, even safety being even in question. Weak, helpless, powerless. Self-determination is the antidote to that experience, I'm claiming. Remember, we heard that there were a variety of different interventions, whether it was a neutral third party, a therapist, a conversation directly with the person we were in conflict with, or time and space away from the other person. Very different choices that the person in conflict made, but that part is consistent. The person in conflict made a choice. Several choices, maybe. A whole list of choices. I'm going to go talk to my therapist about this. I'm going to say certain very specific things that I choose to my therapist about the situation. I'm going to choose to see how my therapist responds. Choices, choices, choices. Freedom to make choices. Now, I can't rule out that an authority figure coming in and telling somebody what to do at that worst moment of conflict could somehow have a beneficial impact. It's possible. It's a complicated, magical world out there. You know, we heard, those of you who were here for the talk about family law arbitration heard some stories about how kind of things get settled. They start the arbitration procedure and they start talking to the parties about which personal property items are going to be in the scope of the arbitration. And sometimes that helps people realize that, boy, we can collaborate not just on which items are in the scope of it, but also who's going to take what, and we don't need the arbitration. Magic happens. And it is largely unpredictable how the magic happens. I'm claiming that the one universal thing that happens is the people directly involved got to make choices. So I'm going to assert, therefore, that if we're involved in mediating, one way to look at the situation we are confronting in a way that doesn't limit the dimensions of the conflict. Again, referring back to Ken Cloke's talk, where he pointed out all the different dimensions, and you can look at things one-dimensionally or two-dimensionally or three-dimensionally or more. And you know, I think his implication, he's implying that the magic comes from these other dimensions that we weren't even conscious of, but that are real and that are happening. So it follows to me that one thing we can do as mediators is do our best not to limit in any way the focus of the conversation. So I was originally trained to help people shift from positions to interests. That was a nice couple of dimensions that we could talk about. What is it that you want from each other? Let's talk about the details of what you want, and let's try to get everybody as much of what you want as you can get. Well, that was interesting and rational, and sometimes, despite all that, people came to some different place with each other. I would suggest that dimension of it, the problem-solving dimension, is going to be easy for a couple of people to sort out if they are in a strong and responsive place with each other. If they're both feeling clear, confident, calm, aware of their options, aware of their resources, and also aware that they're dealing with another human being here, and not a demon, not a monster, but a human, maybe an annoying human, but a human that they don't have to be terrified by, they're going to sort out what they want from each other, no sweat, and they aren't going to need much guidance from us on that. I mean, that's to me the magic that I heard about in these arbitrations. People were all set up to have the arbitrator tell them who was going to get which piece of property. Those folks magically realized that it wasn't that freaking complicated, and they sorted it out. Reactions, comments, complaints at this point, anybody? Thank you so much for sitting there and absorbing what's coming out of my mouth. That is generous of you.
It seems like what you've been talking about the whole time is removing the feeling, removing the emotion, get people to a rational place to think about it.
Ah.
As far as what I'm hearing, at least stepping back, and the feeling being the worst part about what every thought was, how did I feel at the time at that worst moment? That seems to be what makes it the worst moment. Now you're taking them away from that feeling and getting them to a position where they can feel better about themselves because they're coming at it from a different perspective, rational, not emotional.
Interesting. Well, so can I comment on that? Well, so the suggestion, I'll say this again because this is being recorded, and I don't think you probably made it into the mic, but the idea was that I've been basically describing how we can help people go from this emotional place to a more rational place. And I would interpret what I'm saying a little differently from that. I am assuming that there is great meaning in whatever the parties are saying, whatever dimension of it that they're talking about. And I wouldn't assume that we're talking about a less emotional place than at first. I am talking about a shift from weakness to strength and from self-absorption to responsiveness. Those shifts could include, from fear to forgiveness, maybe, from confusion to clarity, from indecisiveness to certainty. I don't know that there's going to be less passion when we get over to this strong and responsive place. So it's not that I'm assuming that the emotions are bad. I'm assuming that this experience of weakness and self-absorption is unpleasant for people. But I don't know that that's the more emotional place necessarily. So I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
It seems like the valence of the emotion changes. So it goes from negative valence to more positive valence. For example, you said forgiveness. I mean, empathy is a positive emotion. You can feel very empathic. It's not that you're not emotional.
Yeah.
Valence has changed.
I suppose so. Valence, happier valence in general. Yeah.
But I do think that when you're in that place that you're talking about, you can cry. You can express what you would have felt weak doing that before.
Yeah.
And you don't feel weak doing that. You own it more. It's like, it's okay for me to cry about this.
That strength could bring with it the readiness to grieve.
Right.
And feel some sadness. It could, to me, strength could be somebody really getting in touch with their anger. And just, okay, yeah, I was overwhelmed, but no, I'm not taking this anymore, and I'm going to fight to the Supreme Court. And I'm not going to complain about that. So let me put one other concept out there that I'm curious how you'll. I just thought of this as I was sitting there earlier. I want to claim that the intention of a mediator to settle the case is incompatible with the mediator's intention to support party self-determination. I'm going to throw that out there for you. I'm going to claim that we got to pick one. And I'm picking self-determination. And I'm picking self-determination partly because I think a lot of cases are going to settle if people have this experience of getting to a stronger, more responsive place. I think that's the best route to a good settlement. And the ones that don't settle it, I'm glad they don't settle it because they've gotten some clarity about what matters to them. And there's a legal system and a whole other things to do besides sit in a mediation room when you get clear about what matters to you if the mediation room ain't going to get you where you need to go. And I don't want to stand in the way of that. Okay, now how you doing? Responses to all that, anybody? Juliet?
It seems to me if it's all about getting a settlement, then it's about the mediator or some external thing and not about the parties so much. I mean, there may be an aspect of that, excuse me, because you're working with them, but the focus is in the wrong place.
Well, so thank you, Juliet. That's a great question. Let me bounce that off you all. So I've heard mediators explain that, yes, they do hope to settle the case because, in general, that's a better place to be than having to continue litigating. It's a lot of good reasons, a lot of advantages to having a settlement instead of a pending litigation. And what's more, they'll confirm before the mediation starts from the parties that you guys would like to settle this case, right? And at some level, parties say something like yes, or they say, well, if I can, but probably. They say something which includes a little bit of a yes, that'd be nice. And so the mediator claims that they're supporting self-determination by saying, okay, I'm going to help you settle it then. And then off they go. So reactions to that little line of logic, anybody? Sharon?
So I can't imagine that all of you haven't had similar experiences where there are some times where you mediate and it does not settle and it feels wonderful. That everybody leaves and it feels good. And there have been times when, at least I will own it myself, where ostensibly they reach an agreement and I leave that mediation feeling horrible.
So you have had this experience of cases that settled feeling like, ooh, that didn't feel that good, and cases that didn't settle, you feel like that was a wonderful experience.
Yes,
and
for everybody.
For everybody. And you're suspecting.
I am supporting your thesis that it's not about the settlement.
Yeah.
That there's something else that is of value that happens in that mediation.
Nice.
And I do think that it becomes a conflict of interest for the mediator to be the one who is most interested in the settlement.
Mm-hmm. So consistently with what Juliet's saying, you're saying that if the mediator is the one who's attached to getting the settlement happen more than the parties, that's about the mediator. That's a conflict of interest. The mediator working their agenda at the expense of the parties. Well, so other things you want to say at this juncture before I give you a whole earful about what I believe a mediator can do if the mediator buys into this basic philosophy. Should I go ahead and do that?
Yeah, I just have one observation.
Yeah.
Sometimes the other person really is a people ogre or whatever language.
Yeah.
Sometimes they really are.
Yeah.
Or narcissistic, and it's not. I mean, sometimes it's just toxic, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it is one way, right?
Uh-huh.
And like being like we're gonna all work it out is kind of abusive.
Absolutely.
Not toxic and narcissistic, right?
Yeah. Love it.
What you're describing is pretext on willingness to be in relationship with the other person as a human being, but like if the other person doesn't really merit that,
Yeah.
you know, like,
yeah.
then what, right?
Well, I'm with you, and I don't want to force somebody to pretend that somebody else is a human when they're not, or is worth dealing with when they're not. And so that's where, so part of what I just did was give you a whole rationale for why I think self-determination is such a big deal, as you all did for starters as well. The good news to me is that if I really commit to that above all else, I'm going to support these people's self-determination every way I can, every moment I'm with them, then darn right I'm not going to nudge anybody toward continuing to sit there with this psychopath. And so That is the beauty. That's kind of how I've got this airtight philosophy. Now, I hope you guys will try to keep me honest, because I've got myself so indoctrinated into this philosophy that I cannot be trusted. I just believe this, and I will have a counter argument for whatever you say about it, but please keep them coming, because I don't want to be nuts here. You know, I just wrote a whole freaking book with this agenda to claim that supporting self-determination of the parties in every moment is the thing to do. And yet there are certainly situations where it's not clear what that means. So my book is mine and my friend Tara's best guesses about how a mediator can live by this ideal. And so for me, as I kind of suggested a minute ago, the first thing that I have to do is let go of any idea that I know what the outcome should be, including settlement, but including, as I think you've pointed out, I shouldn't be attached to the outcome that this person is going to feel better toward that person. That shouldn't be my agenda. So this thing where I described about the cycle and people do get to responsiveness, remember, that might mean clarity that the other person is evil and they should get the hell away from them. It might mean that. Also, I don't know when or what it's going to look like for people to make these kinds of shifts. These are kind of the background philosophy that helped me get very comfortable with the notion that I like it when people make their own choices, because beautiful things like this tend to happen. Shifts towards strength and responsiveness tend to happen when people have a chance to make choices. Another thing that tends to happen, frankly, when people have the chance to make choices is a settlement of their lawsuit. Again, I'm not attached to that, but there are a lot of nice things that happen a lot of the time when people make their own choices. And so I get back to that really being an ideology. Like, ultimately, I think it's a premise, it's a value, it's an assumption that I'm starting with, and that's really why it'd be hard to talk me out of it, because it's just a starting point. People making their own choices is awesome, is where I start and where I end up. As for how that plays out in the mediation, it includes really meaning it when I say that mediation is a voluntary process, not just whether you sit down and start it, but how long you continue it. Within the process, everything that happens is up to you. You get to talk to the other person. You get to yell at the other person. As far as I'm concerned, by the way, I'll pay attention to the person who's being yelled at and make sure they're supported in responding the way they want to respond as well. But you're going to use bad words. You can use the words you choose. You can have the attitude you choose. You can choose not to sit down in the same room with this person. Here's a radical thing that I do that I'd love to hear what you think about. Though my clients have the choice about whether they're in the same room with each other, I choose not to carry messages from one room to the other under any circumstances. Very bad marketing move for those who are expecting to provide lawyers with a process that they're accustomed to, where you carry messages back and forth. At least short term, it's a bad marketing move. At some point, people may discover that, okay, there's this whole different philosophy of mediation that makes a lot of sense that doesn't include that thing. But for now, I'm not recommending it to get you busy to make that rule. And my rationale within this self-determination philosophy for that is, if I were to carry the message, I would be making so many choices about what words to say, what intonation to use, how to respond when the inevitable follow-up question comes from the other person. I would be making so many choices about the very crux of where the crisis is, the communication here, that it would not be about my clients having self-determination, about how that goes down. It's confusing, because a little bit it seems like that's them having self-determination. They want me to carry the message. What part of that don't I understand? They self-determined me to do that. Well, you're right, good point. And so it's a debate, but I come down on, bottom line is, I'm not going to make those choices about how to communicate. I'm just going to make that choice that I don't do that. I'll support you in deciding, since you don't want to be in the room with them, could we set up a phone line to the other room, a Zoom connection to the other room? Do you want to send your lawyer to talk to the other person? What else might you want? You want to write down? I actually might carry, if you wrote down a note for me to hand to them. I might be willing to do that. Practically speaking, my experience is that when I've let the lawyers know that I don't carry messages, they generally figured out how to tolerate being in the same room together. And then, even when the thing they feared would happen, that it got escalated, it has a couple times. And then it turns out that after 10 minutes of escalation, they're in a much different place. One thing that didn't happen when it escalated was the mediator didn't say, okay, this is a bad idea, let's get you separate again. The mediator didn't separate them at the worst possible moment. They happened to have a mediator who knew how to chill and be there with them as they had that escalated moment. And no one has ever been punched in my experience so far. 2 hugs that I had to break up. That's actually true. I mean, there were 2 times when there was an unwanted hug about to happen. An adult woman wanted to hug her elderly mother, and mom was like this, and so I stood up and intervened, and it's a big exception for me to intervene and prevent people from making a choice. But I learned that that's a battery in law school, and I didn't want to be an accomplice or something, so I stopped that. And same thing with a husband who wanted to hug his ex-wife, and she was indicating she wasn't up for it. So I made the judgment call to mess with their self-determination at that moment. Guilty. So it's not perfect. There are times when I've chosen to deviate from all this. How we doing? I kind of want to run my mouth some more about the techniques that I believe are helpful in supporting self-determination. Is that okay? Thank you. The idea is that people constantly have the opportunity to make choices. And when they're in a crisis in their interaction, and the person that they're in that crisis with most often is in a room with them, the choices they make really matter. A choice to look at the other party directly, as opposed to talking to the mediator. A choice to look at the mediator, as opposed to talking to the other party. These are meaningful choices that have a lot to do with how they're doing on that strength and responsiveness continuum. The shift that I often see happen, kind of stereotypical, is when people start off telling the mediator about how difficult it has been to deal with this person, and they can hardly stand to look at him, and then at some point there's a shift in the vibes, and the 2 people are turning and talking to each other. That's in a way subtle, but in a way huge. We got people who have a lawsuit going, and now they're having a conversation with each other. Kind of what they're saying, or even if they're saying really harsh, angry things to each other, I don't know. It's none of my business to evaluate how it's going. That's already me having opinions and evaluations and potentially messing with their self-determination. But a little bit, I get a twinge of, okay, it's going well now. They're talking to each other. A little bit. So they make choices about what to say. How am I contributing if it's all about their choices and I'm not contributing any guidance or leadership? That's frankly, that question right there is the one that made it hard for me to convert to being a transformative mediator, because when I was more of a directive mediator, I got to be in charge. I got to be so smart about what should be talked about first and what should be talked about next. And I would ask questions that made it clear that I was in control and an expert. I then started to believe that, that expertise I had, actually, I don't know that was so smart. In fact, sometimes I was able to get people to a whole divorce agreement, and they were still resentful as could be afterwards, and still went to litigate afterwards, even though I could have sworn we had a deal. So that's that thing you're talking about, Sharon, where I didn't feel good about getting to that settlement, and they didn't either. So letting go of that way of proving that I'm adding value was not easy for me. I had to make a choice to actually add value instead of appear to add value, I think. And the way that I actually add value is to pay attention to them. And often after they say something, I repeat back to them. Anton talked about reflecting people and how powerful that can be. That's a way to support the choices they're making. Juliet says something, says maybe a whole monologue for a few minutes about her whole story, and I say, okay, Juliet, so you really were angry when A, B, and C happened, and you can't believe that he said D, E, and F to you. And so you feel like unless X, Y, and Z happen, you need, to X, Y, Z again. Only I used what she's really said, and I did my best to be true to what she said without spinning it, without reframing it, without sugarcoating it. She made the choice to say those words in that way. I'm here to support this thing where people make choices. She made some. I helped her contemplate the choices she just made by saying back to her exactly what she said. I also helped the other person have another chance to reflect on what this person just said. A reflection is something I often do with this philosophy. Another thing I often do is, after the conversation has been happening for a while, I say, well, let me summarize what you've been talking about. And I will then, with my main focus being accurate, say, you talked about a few different issues. One thing you talked about was how annoying it is to even have to be in the same room with each other. Juliet, you said you can't stand to look at the guy with that face of his, and other guy, Jeff, you said that she's crazy and you can't stand to look at her either. You also talked about how you might settle this thing. You said this and you said this. An accurate summary with full respect to all the things they said, even especially the awkward, heated things, because they said those, and those matter. The way I know they matter is because they said them, and I'm honoring their choices. And then throughout the rest of the process, I'm supporting them and making choices about what's next. There's a comment.
So how do you keep them from getting stuck or evaluating that maybe they continue to make the same bad choice?
So how do I keep them from getting stuck, or and what was the next part?
Well, personally, I probably have to struggle with thinking in my mind that they're making the same bad choice.
Yeah.
You can make choices, but if it's the same bad choice, you're not really going to get very far.
Uh-huh. Well, so part of it is that I'm in favor of them making the same bad choice if they choose to. I'm off the hook there. Part of it is that freedom to make your own choices includes the freedom to make bad choices. And I'm deciding that value is the highest value. That's part of it. Then there's my belief that being said, if you want to maximize the opportunities for people to make other choices, the best way you can do it is shine a light on what's happening. And so maybe if it's clear enough that not that I tried not to evaluate it in the first place, because they're getting this supportive vibe from me, but an honest summary might be, well, so for the full 2 hours that we've been here, you've been talking about A, B, and C, and you've said many times that you're very clear that you aren't going to budge on A or B.
And I still don't like looking at you.
And you still don't like looking at this other person. And you're saying that, yeah, you've repeated yourself many times that no, A and B is you're stuck on it, and he's crazy for even mentioning C. I don't know what to do for people other than shine a light on where they're at. And, my conscience is soothed by giving them the space to make choices. That's my contribution. That's what I do. And it's magic can happen, but also I can't make magic happen, This magic, again, is real, but it doesn't come from me. It comes from me staying the heck out of the way as much as possible. And from me, I believe it's helpful, it's conducive, it fosters maximum magic by keeping the choices in their hands. And so aside from this reflecting and summarizing, there is the occasional, when it seems like it might be helpful, checking in. So folks, we've been talking for a couple hours about these two topics. Your choice, what's next here? We could take a break. Maybe there's a different topic you want to talk about. Maybe you'd like to continue talking about A and B some more. What do you say, folks? It's very simple, actually. It's not that easy, because one has to let go of all of these other ways of thinking, but it's pretty simple. Yes, Juliet?
I want to just kind of reiterate something that, to me, is the power in this is that when you are reflecting you're using a third-party voice in a matter-of-fact way, pretty much, just saying to each party, you're saying to the party who spoke what you heard them say. They hear themselves, and the other person also hears what that person is saying, just by the simple fact that it comes from somebody else. And I think it's more hearable, if you will, that way. And the other part is, putting the onus on them, like with the check-in, what do you want to do next? I think it just creates such a different dynamic that they take it on. They take more on than they normally would, and that leads to the empowerment and the recognition. And
it can totally have that effect. Absolutely. That's part of the hope. Yes, Sharon.
So Dan knows that I don't fully describe myself as a transformative mediator, because I would, and I want to ask you the question, what I would be inclined to do, and to see whether this is one of those examples why it goes further, is to reflect it back, do that summary, what was going on, is this working for you? Is to actually ask the question, not just leave it at what would you like to do now, but actually to ask, is this working?
So to me, this is not an exact science, what we're talking about here at all. Incidentally, to the extent there's anything sciencey, just quick digression, then I'll answer your question, Sharon. To the extent there's any science to refer to about what works in mediation, there was a couple of great studies from the state of Maryland a few years ago. They did a nice job analyzing mediator interventions and to what extent they were associated with certain outcomes, and it tended to support the idea that largely what we're talking about, very client-centered, party-focused, less directive, less evaluative interventions tended to lead to all the good stuff in general. But those are not randomized controlled trials. We don't have science. And we certainly don't have science that gets to the fine points of exactly what the optimal response for a mediator at any certain moment is. So it does come down to being an art a bit. And so if I try to do what I believe is most conducive to the idea that you all have choices to make, and now's one of those moments when you get to make a choice. And maybe your question is totally consistent with that, or maybe it's a little bit directive because it's asking them to answer that specific question at that moment, and that was your idea. So that would be the question on my mind about it. I just want to quickly, we're in our last minute here. I'm available to chat after the minute's over, but I want people to feel free to bail at 5 sharp. I was just, so this is maybe just evidence of how crazy I am. I was able to translate this whole day's program into why self-determination in mediation matters. And so we started with Jim Coben's talk about the ways in which mediations go wrong. And he talked about how enforcement actions of mediations are kind of the most common sort of case that comes up later. Somebody tries to enforce a mediation agreement that somebody, at least one side apparently, doesn't want to carry out. Now, I can't prevent that happening in a future from a mediation, but I think if there is a way to make that less likely, it's to make sure that nobody in any way got nudged, guided, smoothly led by the mediator to that agreement. I think one way to make basically all of the litigation around mediation less likely is to make sure to provide a process where the mediator, at least, did not nudge people toward a certain outcome, and in fact, did his or her best. Oh, that's my alarm saying we have 2 minutes left. The mediator, in fact, did his or her best to support them in making their own choices every step of the way, to make it a little bit less likely that they commit to something that, for whatever reason, later they're going to feel bad about. The rules, the new rules can feel a bit overwhelming, just because rules often are. The providing a process to mediation clients that, again, didn't include them getting talked into anything or talked down to in an overly formal process. If you're worried about ethics complaints, I think if your clients experience you as somebody who is totally respectful of them and let them make their own choices, it's a great way to avoid ethics complaints. Ken Cloak's discussion of magic in mediation, and particularly all the different dimensions that things are happening on, I think it's totally true. I think Ken has a little more confidence that he knows which magic needs to happen at which moment, because he'll ask the right question to reveal something. I don't believe that I know which questions to ask at which moment that are going to reveal the thing. I believe my greatest contribution is to stay the heck out of the way so that there's as much space as possible for the parties to get clear about what matters to them and what this is all about and what's happening on some other level so they can talk about it. I didn't get to see the 5 important new developments on arbitration law, but I saw the family law arbitration discussion. And again, you know, the story there about some kind of creative interventions for people who are disagreeing about what to do with their personal property, say, is great. And part of the beautiful diversity of practices we have here is that people can choose to avail themselves of people who will give them a decision about what to do with their property. And that itself is a choice that people should be free to make. And as we heard from some of those folks, on the way to that arbitration decision, people often have the epiphany that they can sort this out on their own themselves anyway. And so those are different processes that I'm talking about, but the relevance of parties making their choices to pursue those processes and then to decide they don't need those processes, that is the thing that leads to the good place, even there. How to de-escalate conflict in your mediation? I must say that I've never attempted to de-escalate conflict in my mediations. In fact, when it escalates, I assume people are talking about what really matters at that moment. And paradoxically, that turns out to de-escalate the conflict a lot, because people get heard right away, they don't experience any resistance, they get on to a different, calmer place most often. I have really appreciated your indulgence as I have run my mouth here. Very kind of you. I love to talk about this stuff. I wrote a whole book about it. I'll just say the title of the book because it's actually relevant to the topic. So Self-Determination and Mediation, the Art and Science of Mirrors and Lights. These last few interventions that I described to you, a metaphor for them is mirrors and lights. We hold up mirrors to parties by reflecting what they say. We shine a light on their conversation, strictly trying to illuminate what they've said and where they're at so they can make clear choices about what's next. There's a little bit of science that supports this is what people want, but there's a lot of art in the practice of trying to help people maximize their self-determination. Thanks so much. Good night.